the exact difference between your summers, the summers your parents used to have, and the next 20 to come. Because the ridiculous conditions Australia is living with this summer are on everyone's minds right now. And if you look at the data, this summer is nothing like the summers that, say, our parents grew up with. So today we're talking to someone who's looked really closely at that contrast.
My name's Tim Leslie. I'm a journalist with the ABC's Story Lab.
So Tim helped build this interactive tool for ABC Online, which a lot of people have been using this week.
The idea is that you enter your age and basically it tells you your personal experience of climate change. Or to put it another way, it measures what exactly has changed over your lifetime.
Our team's remit is to try to tackle tricky editorial stories. That's part of our job. And for me, climate change was something that it's hard to do well as a journalist. And I think what we were trying to do with this story was, for a lot of people, climate change is something that's happening far away and in the future. You know, a polar bear falling into the water when the polar ice caps melt.
Right.
And what we wanted to do was really try to shift the frame to show it as something that's kind of been happening throughout your entire life and make it much more personal, because this isn't a story about the environment. This is a story about yourself. This is about, you know, how you survive. And I think that's been one of the issues with reporting on it, is that it's framed as the reef will die and all these things that are kind of external to people's lives. Whereas, as we're seeing now with the bushfires, the realities of climate change are kind of have deep implications for how we live.
So it's about ripping it out of the abstract and making it real.
Yeah, exactly.
How have you tried to put people at the middle of this?
The challenge with these sorts of stories is everyone is different. But what we wanted to do was to tap into two things. One, that kind of sense of childhood. And the other thing is that idea that often you hear this line trotted out, well, it was hot when I was a kid, or we've always had bushfires. And so what we did is we created a piece that looked at the temperature record going back 100 years, and then the audience could select the year they were born. And then from that, we told a personalised story which looked at their life compared to, a kid growing up today.
So obviously we wanted to test this out, and we figured where better to start than with Stephen Stockwell, because, wait, when were you born?
1986.
Are you sure?
Yes, which means I am 33.
Okay, so how much could things really have changed in 33 years?
You're kind of pretty young in the scheme of things in this temperature change, but the year you were born, Australia was sort of 0.2 of a degree above average, or 0.21 degrees, and that's 1.12 degrees cooler than Australia's hottest year on record. So just in your lifetime, we've seen that 1 degree increase in temperatures. And, you know, that's only in sort of 33 years, if my maths is right.
And I've never seen a year below the average temperature.
Never. There's a few where it's 0.0 of a 0.02 of a degree below, so you can maybe argue that, but that's pretty much just an average year. And I think there's probably one thing that's worth noting here is that we're comparing it to an average of temperatures between 1960 and 1990. So some of that warming's already kind of baked in. If we were comparing it to temperatures, say, pre-industrial era temperatures or the first half of the 20th century, that increase would be even more stark. But even with that fairly kind of, recent comparison, you haven't experienced a year where temperatures are significantly below average, and you have also experienced a significant rise in temperatures just in that, 3 and a bit decades. And your, 1989, temperatures are above average, but you're still got a year in there where it's about an average temperature, and it's significantly cooler. Whereas, you're still. Hang on, let me have a look. Sorry, guys. So the year you were born, it was actually a little bit cooler, and so it was 1.36 degrees cooler than Australia's hottest year on record, which was 2013. So even someone as young as you has already experienced that rise in their lifetime.
just to get a sense of scale, I did want to run my mum's situation past you. So she grew up on the northern beaches of Sydney, would spend long days, at the beach with her 7 brothers and sisters and her mum. And she was born in 56.
Yep.
Sorry, Mum, I'm outing you. And she does listen every day. And so she would have been, I guess, going to Harbord and places like that in the 60s, from the sort of mid-60s, early 60s onwards. What kind of changes has someone like my mum seen over the course of their life in Australia in the way they experience the climate?
She's really smack bang in that experience where you probably say her early life is maybe an experience of what kind of normal temperatures were for much of the 20th century and going back further, where, the year she was born, it was cooler than average. And then in her first 5 years, there were a few years where it got a little bit higher. But, for most of kind of her formative years, there was that variation where some years were warmer and some years were cooler. And, you compare that to sort of your formative years, all that variability's gone. It's either close to average or warmer.
So that increase of more than 1 degree just in the course of our lifetime is not good, but also out of context, it doesn't sound super shocking. As in, if you're standing in a room, you probably wouldn't notice the difference if someone cranked the heater from 21 to 22 degrees. But that change means something totally different in the context of a climate system and as an average.
As you say, it'd be nice if 1 degree increase was every day was 1 degree warmer. But what actually is happening is that you're seeing an increase in the extremes. You go from a situation where in the first half of the 20th century, you get maybe, 5, max 10 days of this extreme heat where it's like above the 99th percentile of each month. So it means like you average out the temperatures for a month, and in a year, there's maybe a couple of days where you exceed that. Flash forward, to 2013, and you've got almost a month of that. And that month would be, likely to be concentrated around summer. And that's what's really scary about this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the government has said quite famously at this point, I think, now is not the time to talk about climate change, referring to the bushfire crisis that's sort of across the eastern seaboard right now.
We've had fires in Australia since time began. And what people need now is a little bit of sympathy, understanding and real assistance. They don't need the ravings of some pure, enlightened and woke capital city greenies.
Let me support Gladys and the Prime Minister. This is an absolute disgrace for anyone to be talking about climate change while we've lost lives and we've lost assets.
You've just been through this process of really forensically charting the temperature increase over the last decades and the link with weather events. What does that data and what do the experts tell you about the link between those things?
Yeah, so there's a fairly, as I said, a very strong link between this increase in temperature and a drying out of large parts of Australia and an increase in bushfire risk. And that's mapped over the decade.
Okay, so dare we ask, what about the kids who were born now?
Well, obviously that depends on how quick humankind is at decarbonising the global economy, but on the current trajectory, it's not pretty.
By the time a child born today is 20, the sort of last summer we sweltered through, which, in the eyes of a lot of people is an extreme summer, that would be considered a mild Australian summer. And, I know I talked about the reef earlier as something that's kind of outside of the normal experience. But, by the time a child born today is 30, in a business as usual scenario, they're looking at like bleaching every year. And, that gets pretty scary. And then say they're, by the time they're 50, by this point, these fairly severe temperature rises are locked in. And, there's a study that came out recently which talks about, some of the possibilities under this modelling. And we're talking 50-degree days in Sydney and Melbourne. And that's...
Pardon? Sorry, what?
Yeah, that's scary stuff, right? So that's the kind of if we don't do anything.
Say I had a kid in a week's time, which would be a surprise. I'm not pregnant, but say I had a baby. How different in concrete ways would that child's childhood be from the one that my mother experienced in 1960s Sydney? What are some of the tangible, concrete differences in how they would lead their day-to-day lives?
I've got 2 young kids, so I think about this a bit. And I think for me, the most tangible increase, the most tangible example of this is that increase in extreme heat. You know, your mum in her formative years didn't experience very much of that. Whereas, you know, my 6-year-old daughter, that's her experience of summer. You know, we had a 42-degree day on Saturday and we were inside with the air conditioning on. Now, you know, Brisbane and Sydney have had 42-degree days before, and, you know, that's not to say they didn't exist. But what's happening is the frequency of those days is increasing.
And that means, I guess, more time spent indoors, greater risks associated with exposure to that kind of heat, be it, you know, something like sunburn or, you know, if you're living in certain parts of Australia, risks like bushfires.
Yeah, definitely. You've got far greater chance a kid born today is going to be, you know, as kids in Sydney are spending a couple of weeks inside during spring because of bushfire risk, and then a far greater chance that a kid is going to be experiencing those really extreme hot days where they're going to be stuck inside. And that's the thing. This is just the situation that kids are currently living with. This is just the past 6 years, and that's a 1 degree temperature increase. We're currently on track for maybe 4 degrees this century. So I don't think anyone has a clear idea of, you know, it's very hard to know exactly sort of how those changes will play out on humanity. They're very clear about, you know, what's going to happen with the temperature, and all the modelling has been depressingly accurate. But I think the thing is, what we have to start to work out is, you know, that impact on that idea of the Australian life, that idea of summer as a time that you look forward to and very central to growing up, shifts away to something that's much more sinister and extreme.